showing me as a interpreter.
I should have removed you from the list, but I've also handed over the host capabilities, so we might need assistance from Aaron on that.
Okay. Because I know there is an interpreter, we will have one, but for Spanish, I think her name, I don't know if she's already with us. Let me check. Anneli Zapata. Miss Anneli, are you listening to us? Okay.
I see her in here.
Yes, she is there. She's
Right.
there. Excellent. Because I am starting to get just a little afraid because I'm seeing the interpreter thing here for me, and I don't know if this will affect her somehow.
I don't know. Should we click on the interpretation button? Is that what that is? I've never done it with an interpreter before.
That's how I accessed it when I needed interpretation.
Okay, you just click that button. Okay.
I think Maria needs some help.
Yes, I'm an
yes.
interpreter too. Could you put me as an interpreter, please?
Yes, let's
along with Anneli.
Perfect. So I'm going to ask some help to Miranda and to Aaron. If you could place Maria and Miss Zapata as the interpreters.
So Aaron, under the interpretation button, you should see manage interpreters, and there will be a list where you can add them by name. Particularly the people in the room will be listed. So that should be fairly straightforward. If you have any trouble,
I see it. Thank you. I'll set it up right now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you
everyone for your patience.
Thank you, everyone, really, for the patience of all of you. And Aaron, I'm going to ask you if you could take me out as an interpreter. I'm really afraid I'm going to press the button by mistake and my voice will disappear, please, if possible. But that said, I just want to take some time. We are already being recorded. So I'd like to welcome each and every one of you. This is going to be a very pleasant and I'm pretty sure enriching conversation about the connections between journalism, media literacy, and communication and education. Of course, we have a wonderful panel here, and following the principles and the goals of the event, it's going to be a very interesting and multicultural one, as we have professors from North America, from South America, from Argentina, and from Brazil, my country too. So I would like to thank everyone. I think we're having some problem with the interpretation. Aaron or Miranda, if you could help us. Some people are not listening to the interpretation.
Aaron, if you'd like to pass host back.
He's in the middle of actually doing it right now.
Oh, okay.
He's almost done with it. Yeah.
Yes, I'm not an interpreter in this. It's being indicated as an interpreter.
I see INT by your name.
Oh yeah, so let me take that out because they asked me to moderate the table. Should someone else take this function?
No, that's fine. That's fine. I think it might just be left over from other settings.
We're removing you right now. Don't worry. We got it. Almost done. A few more seconds.
Okay.
Spanish. All the interpreters are in Spanish, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. It should have fixed.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you so much, Miranda. I'm going to rename myself so there are no mistakes here. But first, is everyone able to listen to me? Excellent. Perfect. So guys, my name is Alexandre. I am from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and I have the honor and the pleasure of welcoming this wonderful panel that we have here today. We are going to have, I'm pretty sure, a delightful conversation, and we're going to listen from wonderful presenters and professors and researchers. connecting both North America and Latin America as a whole. I would like to remind everyone that this meeting is being recorded and ask anyone who is under 18 years old to please turn off the camera, and if it wants to preserve its own anonymity, please take away your name if you're under 18, please. That said, we also have a live interpretation happening, and I'd like to ask our brilliant panelists in order to help our wonderful interpreters just to try to speak not so fast. I know it's very hard. I have this difficulty, but I'm pretty sure they would deeply appreciate. So that said, I'd like to welcome our first presenter today, following the planning that we had. The first presenter we will have will be Professor James Wittebols. Professor James is a professor of political science at the University of Windsor. He is a sociologist who teaches media and communication courses in the intersection of media, politics, and culture. He taught media literacy for 17 years at Niagara University and developed an information literacy course at the University of Windsor. He has published information literacy research at Communications in Information Literacy, the Canadian Journal for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, and Journalism and Mass Communication. And he's also a journalism and mass communication educator. Professor Wittebols, please.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Alexander. So I'm going to put myself on a timer here so that I don't absorb too much more time here. I'm going to try and keep this to 10 minutes so we have time for discussion. So my talk is titled Process over Content, Information and News Literacy in a Post-Truth World. Paulo Freire has been at the center of my pedagogy since I was a graduate student. I'm going to date myself, in the late 1970s. I was part of a group back then which tried to create a Sociology 101 course around Freire's principles. I think all of us that have participated would regard that as a failure. But I took that into when I got teaching positions, I kept that orientation. My dissertation was actually on creating more critical news consumption in the early 1980s. So my research has come full circle. In the interim, I've done content analyses of various media programs, and now I'm back to change consciousness. I am both a political economist and a social psychologist who is focused on making linkages between the news and the way people think about it. And so the confirmation bias assignment that I'm going to talk about here is the culmination of that. I've never had a successful course like this one. I'll elaborate on that. Having said that, I've always built experiential assignments in my courses, generally, but especially for media literacy. For example, I'll have students count all the ads they're exposed to for a day and analyze the themes and how they're moved by different ads, et cetera, et cetera. I had students do power analyses of narratives, gender and race in storytelling. I asked students to pick the program they like the most to analyze. And then lastly, which was a real convoluted one, trying to find the influence of public relations in news articles. The current course, which is an information and news literacy course, emerged from my frustration with student use of the net to do research. So again, just to remind you, I was one of those people who actually went to a library way back then. When you had to write a paper, you had to go to the library. So it's rather frustrating for me to make that kind of effort, and students can do it from their computer, but they're doing it very lazily. The course was an iterative process. It wasn't until the third time I taught it that I felt it was fulfilling my aspirations for the course. So I made a lot of mistakes, but I learned from them. Some of you may know that information literacy is sort of the province of librarians. That can present campus politics issues when you try to start crusading for an information and news literacy course that everyone takes. So I've worked with libraries on this, and of course I taught media literacy, and when I taught media literacy, half of it was news, half was culture. The two breakthroughs in this course are the use of a flipped classroom, and as I mentioned earlier, the confirmation bias assignment. The flipped classroom, if you're familiar with that, it's basically dropping the idea of lectures and the idea of the instructor as being at the center of the course. It's student-centered. Somebody used the word constructivist. It is a constructivist course last night I saw, which I was pleased to see. So basically, students do things at home. They view lectures or read things at home, and classes are used for activities. We get into discussion, I can talk about the kinds of activities we do there. So the flipped classroom stuff started at K through 12, at the K through 12 level, at the university level. It was picked up by math and engineering. And interestingly, they focused on achievement. The research is mixed on the effectiveness of traditional versus flipped classrooms in the sciences. But in the social sciences and humanities, it's become a thing. It's about learning. It's not about achievement, it's about learning. And flipped classrooms can be used to engender critical thinking and lively dialogue. The issue is, and I was noticing in our session last night, that everybody was busy being experts. You have to let go of that. In the post-truth world, there's no respect for experts. So we need to come at a way where students realize their gaps in their knowledge, their lack of media literacy themselves, and then go do something about it. So I do mini lectures. I do a mini lecture for the confirmation bias assignment. We do discussions about readings, and the students do that the night before. They submit to me via email a summary of the reading with a question for the group to discuss. This has opened up discussions in a way that I've never experienced them before. It works. And on top of that, I dropped the exam. I gave them an essay exam over the readings. Since we're doing the discussions in class, they're turning papers into me that show they get the material. No need for an exam. That for me is real Freire. Confirmation bias is the second technique, and I assume everyone's familiar with it. I would argue Freire's techniques begin with creating cognitive dissonance in students to make things problematic, problematization that he termed. And cognitive dissonance is about disrupting one's belief system. Now, what's interesting about that is that curiosity also emerges from a disruption in what we think we know. So I've been able to extend the value of the course to creating more curious students who are, they don't have the world figured out anymore. The life is problematic for them. So confirmation bias is the easy way to resolve cognitive dissonance. And so I try to create a situation to get students away from that. We are often our own worst enemies when it comes to assessing the truth of something. That comes up in the literature constantly. So I give a mini lecture and some concrete video examples, emphasis on concrete. I imagine if you've taken a psych class and were introduced to this many years ago, you probably got the number sequence test as sort of, oh, you're confirming your bias. I won't go into that because it's stupid. It's very abstract. It's not concrete. The way I do this is to first of all, talk about when I engage in confirmation bias so that nobody else thinks that they're immune from it. And secondly, to try and get them to look at some examples online through YouTube. There was one that was great about, it was anti-evolution. It was intelligent design. And he was arguing that the banana was made by God and it's perfect because you can put a hand on it and you can peel it down and you don't get your hands dirty, blah, blah, blah. Of course, at the end of the video, they flash the many different varieties of bananas that exist in the world. So that one always generates a little laughter, but it's fun too. So the students then spend a week focusing on media, those around them, and most importantly, themselves when they are engaging in confirmation bias. They turn in a 4 to 5 page paper of their experience, and it's a real eye-opener for them. They enjoy it. There's often some amusing instances of engaging in it. I like to tell them when you're watching sports, you're constantly engaging in confirmation bias. So after that, they go off and complete 3 major assignments, which are related to news and information literacy, using a social justice topic of their choosing. They examine the websites for integrity. These are policy and advocacy websites on their issue. They then access news about their issue across the board. And they do an analysis of what constitutes a quality news story about their particular issue. The final project, I'm in a political science department, is that they link that to peer-reviewed research on their issue. So they're going to link up the policy and advocacy stuff, link up the news, and then link up the peer-reviewed stuff to see how well each translates between the two. Most peer-reviewed research is going to be very favorable to social justice orientation. It just works out that way. I've published several papers on this. Alexander mentioned that. One of them is just about students' reactions to the course. About half the students in the course say it should be required of all students. We're in FOSS, a social science and humanities school. I usually get 1 or 2 students who will say everybody should take this class, but in this class, it's much more pervasive, and it's not any charisma on my part, believe me. I have turned a climate skeptic into a climate change activist. One student gave up tobacco after the confirmation bias assignment because he decided he was diluting himself. And lastly, when the students present their paper or the summary of their semester research, we run overtime. The discussion's off the charts. I mean, I sort of I'm having to expand the number of presentation times in order to get a good amount of discussion in there. So it's a real, it's unlike any course I've ever taught before in terms of the feedback I've gotten. I'm now on sabbatical writing a book that will be published next year by Peter Lang. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I look forward to dialogue.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Wittebols. It was a sensational presentation. I'm pretty sure the issue of bias and media bias is in the center of not only your work, but in all of our works, and how we as educators and media analysts and researchers deal with this phenomenon. So I'm pretty excited to see the questions will be made for you in the end of the presentations.
I'm sorry I talk so fast, translators.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. And don't worry, this happens. But now I have the honor of calling to make her presentation Professor Katina Paron. Professor Perron is a journalist, educator, and editor. She's also an MJE, and she has helped thousands of teams earn bylines in professional publications. She is responsible for an award-winning project called Since Parkland to support the student publications. And in her work, she seeks to elevate voices and experiences of young people and provide journalism training and mentorship to teens. She's also the author of a Newshound's Guide to Student Journalism. And besides this, she also manages the Teach for Chicago journalism program at Medio. And she teaches journalism at the City University of New York. And besides all of this, she also edits The Future is Miss, a teen-written column for the Miss magazine. Her articles and scholastic journalism have appeared in the New York Times and in the radio WNYC. And you can find her on Twitter too, at Katina Paron, and on Instagram at Dear Teen Journalist. I really wanted to mention her entire curriculum because I think it's so rich and it exemplifies this connection between journalism, communication, and education. And I'm pretty excited to listen from Professor Perron. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I put my contact information in the chat so people have that. How much time do I have? I have 10 minutes or what do I?
Yes,
Okay.
I would advise that.
Okay, we'll see how this goes. And as a New Yorker, I also talk fast. So we're gonna make this happen. If someone needs to tell me to slow down or to shut up, feel free to do so. I will not take offense. What I'm going to do is share my screen with you all because I put together a little presentation that just kind of goes through all the different projects that I worked on. And so not all of them, but some of them. So the idea behind this presentation and the projects I'm going to show you is to kind of make the point that how young people, journalism can help young people understand the world around them and give them the tools they need to create action in their communities, in their neighborhoods, in the worlds that they see. So first of all, kind of focus of why journalism. So journalism is inquiry-based, right? I mean, not only in terms of interviewing people and asking questions, but really in terms of finding the answers for a community problem or reporting on an issue that has a lot of impact in the community. It's a great way for young people to understand the world. They learn who's in charge of what, who makes the rules, and then they get to actually interview those people. If they want more bike racks in their community, they can interview the transportation commissioner about why aren't there more bike racks. So it really gives them a sense to understand the world and for them to see their place as a young person and as a journalist and how those two play together. It's a really great, journalism is a great way for young people to create action. They think of a problem, they know there's an issue at hand, and by reporting, the act of publishing a piece of journalism, that helps them kind of see how things can change, and that's their contribution to the community, especially when there's larger issues like climate change. A teen isn't going to fix climate change, but what they can do and how they can participate in that is through journalism. It gives them access to power, especially here in the US when we talk about the media as the fourth branch of government. Having young people be part of those branches is really important for them to see that they have access to power. And then that creates this power shift between young people and the adults around them, right? That as media, they can ask adults, they can ask politicians, elected officials questions, and those adults have to answer them because they are part of the media. And if they don't, their answers or their neglect of answering will be published. So it really helps create this power shift. So I'm going to go through just a few projects. Because I have 10 minutes, I'm going to skip that one. So the first one I want to talk about is Inside Climate News, which is an environmental journalism or an environmental news site. They cover climate change issues. And so for 2 years, we ran camps for teens to learn how to become environmental journalists. And it was a really fascinating program because not only are they learning kind of the idea of environmental justice and action and how to take your personal activism and possibly make that into a story, but really how to turn themselves into journalists. And a lot of these kids either had interest in journalism or had interest in the environment. And this was a great way to give them this hands-on approach. And the pictures you see here are from a program we ran in Maine. So it's really hands-on, and they were learning the science about it. And they were also publishing stories. So here's just a few of the outlets that published some of the teen stories over the 2 years. So the idea was, they worked on a piece of journalism and then they pitched these articles to these publications. So they got to really branch that divide between being a kid and also getting their work out there while they're learning about what it means to be environmental journalists. Here you can see kind of some of their headlines. So they wrote about marine plastic pollution, climate change. They did a profile, talk about Kentucky and investing millions in fossil fuel. So you can see the stories kind of ran all over. One of the teams entered their photo on the top, I guess my top left, into a contest, and it won for the New York Times. So these are really, this is all came out of this program, where the mission was to teach young people, kind of help them be the next generation of environmental journalists. Another project that worked on that Alexander mentioned was Sense Parkland. So Sense Parkland was this amazing, kind of one of the most important projects I'll ever do in my life, and these young people who worked on this, for them too. We had 216 teen journalists from around the country report on the 1,200 young people who died because of gun violence after the shooting in Parkland, Florida. It was a really intense project. And I'm not going to go through and read this, but I'll show you a few of them. So these were the profiles the young people, the reporters wrote. They were heavily sourced. So when we talk about news literacy principles, there's a lot of sourcing. There's a lot of focusing on kind of resource distribution, who gets to tell whose story, why are they the right people to tell the stories of their generation, and how the media makes mistakes and who they make mistakes with. And often it was the Black and brown teens in Baltimore, in Detroit, in Oakland, in Chicago, who got their names spelled wrong, who got their ages wrong. And the young people who worked on this really saw that. And we had to spend a lot of time talking about self-care. As you can imagine, if you're a teenager writing about someone who's your age or who's your sibling age who died because of gun violence, it can take a toll. So these are some of here's another one. These are kind of some of the issues we dealt with, but this was a groundbreaking project, and it was award winning. And part of the kind of the takeaway from this, especially from a larger media aspect, was that young journalists can produce this type of work, that it's not only first person reporting, that they really have, there's certain stories that only they can tell. And so it brings up a lot of initiative and activism in themselves to be able to tell these stories. So you can see in the design of the website was amazing too, but we kind of divided up young people based on who was an athlete, who was a community volunteer, who was college bound, who was adventurers. And they all kind of, we grouped them together in these ways to kind of make the 1,200 names a little more accessible to readers. But it really helped young people, the reporters who worked on this, see, and I'm going to skip ahead. This is just one example. This one teen, Zoe Sue, did all of these pieces over 9 months. So it was really heavy, and these are like the most amazing young people I'll ever work with, and I'm still in touch with many of them. I'm going to skip this one just for time, but you can see this is this article in the blue is the one the teens wrote, and what they learned from this, and you can see some of their quotes here, is how they felt powerless before this project. They were scared, they were angry, and working on this as journalists allowed them that sort of participation in their community, that action that they needed to really feel like that they can make a difference, right? And they write in this last paragraph, we're still frightened, they're frustrated, but they learned that they're not powerless. That's what this project taught them. And that's what our goal is when we're talking about young people and activism, right? Like this is, and this is a project that was, huge. It cost a lot of money. But it was such an important thing for these young people. And it also taught adults what young people can do. Transitioning from that to my book, A Newtown's Guide to Student Journalism. One of the reasons why I wrote this, you can see this is the cast of characters of the student paper in the book, with my illustrator, Javier Agelsi, was I saw the gap of what young people were learning in school versus what they needed to know professionally, especially because I was working with a lot of teens I was helping them create bylines and earn bylines. So I needed to fill that gap. And a lot of it was young people don't know. Most adults haven't been interviewed by a journalist. Most adults don't really know what it means to be a journalist. So in order to show young people what journalism looked like, I created this book as a way of, and it's a comic book novel, if you can't tell, approach to it, right? So here are some of the stories. And the idea is to show them, show, don't tell. That's a classic writing advice, right? And so I wanted to use that for them to see what journalism looked like. And especially for young people who make mistakes. We all make mistakes, and that's how we learn. And that you know, journalism isn't, you know, there are some do's and don'ts in the book, but it's really an action-oriented activity, and you learn it when you do it. So I wanted them to kind of get in the habit of doing it versus reading about it. And so you can see there's like the characters, you know, there's the whole book is really kind of focused on helping young people see themselves in what it means to be a journalist, especially in some of these high schools, especially in the US, where even if the school is pretty diverse, the newsroom isn't. And that a lot of teens of color don't see themselves as journalists because the white kids do journalism. And so I wanted to kind of squelch that idea, because it's not as true in New York City as it is in some other places. I'm based in New York. So I wanted to write this, I wanted to show them that they could be journalists, whether, doesn't matter what their ethnicity or race is, doesn't matter if they have a disability, like they can be a journalist too. And that was part of the background of this, and really reaching at that level. There's some what I call like breakout pages and takeaways about what it means. So it's not all comic book. There's these ideas of you know, teach them this idea that journalism is the practice of verification, right? And what that means. And they see that in the stories, and then we break it down from them. And all the stories, I think I have an example here, right? So all the stories are ripped from the headlines. So they're very based on, you know, something that happened in the world. Like there's a story about plagiarism in the book. And you see here, I break down some famous US-based cases of plagiarism. So really kind of educating them on the background of journalism, as well as giving them the real life, how this might look in their schools. So, and there's activities too. And so the idea is also, I was thinking about this book for kids who don't have a journalism program in their school, but are interested in journalism, that there's activities in it to really, you know, challenge them to teach themselves. And a lot of, you know, whether they, you know, I've heard from a lot of teens who are like, yeah, the journalism newspaper in my school isn't great. And so I wanted, and those kids are ones that want to do this themselves and really be action oriented in it. So a list of activities to help them do that. This might be, so I may actually fall in on time, we'll see. One of the projects, and the last project that I'm talking about. So The Future is Ms. Is a column that I've been working on for 3 years for Ms. Magazine. And the idea was that young people, that girls, female identified teens, would write articles about girl activists in their communities, or that they knew about, that were making a real impact. And Ms. had never published regularly voices of young people before, and especially young writers. And so we got a grant to pay teens, especially teen girls, who may be willing to do things for free. But as probably a lot of us here know, that we often get asked to do things for free, but that doesn't really, you know, isn't a great lesson to teach young people, especially young girls. So we pay them in the process. And a lot of the, you know, since Parkland, we paid the teens too. A lot of the projects, teens get paid for the work that they produce, with the idea for them to show them how much we value as adults, or as a publication, the work that they produce. So this was one of kind of the project. And so here I'll show you some stories that they did. So how to organize a teen protest, 2 girls talking about changing their school's name to honor John Lewis. So these are very like topical things, and these are very, you know, things that are happening not only in their community, but in the larger context of you know, what it means to be human right now. And they really focused on young people making a difference there. So these are another one, a teen activist empowers Asian girls to fight for change. So these stories are really kind of making news onto themselves, because they're focused, there's a clear news peg, right? Something, you know, the Asian American hate crime in the US, probably internationally, but I don't know, went up during the pandemic. And so the story was focused on this one teenage girl who started a podcast to kind of focus on this and to help other teenage Asian girls like her, which is an amazing thing for young people to do it, right? I mean, just say like, hey, I see a need, I'm gonna go fix it and create this type of impact and really help other young people, help other Asian girls in this case, kind of see their place in a larger context, which is really what the point is that we're trying to do with a lot of these, and create the journalism skills too, right? That they're not only, I mean, they're learning about genderism, they're learning about sexism, they're learning, you know, the kind of the basics of journalism, but they're also learning, how does this work? Who, you know, when they report on stories about someone changing a law, they have to then find out, like, how does that law get changed in that state and report on it. So there's a lot that falls into it. And all these stories took, they usually took like 5 to 9 weeks to produce. There were anywhere from 4 to 7 drafts. It wasn't as if they just turned them in and I'm like, thumbs up, this is great, let's publish it. There was a lot of back and forth to get them to here, but that's the kind of the goal of youth. That's part of the process of youth media, is keeping the bar this high, making sure that they're producing high quality publishable content while learning throughout the process. And that's why it's not just like, here's a press pass, go report. It's really this training that has so much to do with the impact of the outcome. Oh, good, look at that. I didn't time myself, I should have set a timer. But let's pretend like I was perfectly in my 10-minute frame. My contact information again, feel free to reach out to me, and I'd love to hear more from you, or what you're thinking, or even projects that you've done that have fit into this context. So thank you for that.
Professor Perron, it was a privilege listening to you, and I can see, based on the comments we have on the sidebar, that not only is your work perceived as sensational, because it is also inspirational. Many people there are commenting as teachers and media literacy teachers about how they will try to steal your ideas and use in their own classrooms, which I think is great.
Please steal my ideas like that. They're not mine. I did not invent this. Steal my ideas, reach out to me for more support or more information about any of these projects. This is, I mean, the idea of giving young people the freedom to report on what they want, which is exactly what James said about his students, right? They get to pick their topic. Like, this is that engagement and that ownership is so important in this process.
For sure. For sure, Professor Perron. And I could identify some connecting links between your own research and Professor Wittebols' research in regards not only to bias, but also in regards to some subjects that seem to be key elements in studying media literacy and how media literacy can be used: global warming, climate change, sexism, racism. But I'm not going to pose any questions now. I want to invite people to write questions on the sidebar. But first, I would like to invite Professor Bosone to join us. And before I give him the word, I would like to inform you of his biography and say that, unfortunately, Professor Wania Bittencourt from the Federal University of Santa Catarina, unfortunately, hasn't arrived to the table. I hope everything's okay with her. We will inform if we have any information about it. But as I mentioned, we are now going to listen from Professor Bussone. Professor Iván Bussone is a professor in psychology and sciences of education, having graduated from the Institute of Education, Inspector Albino S. Barros, from La Rioja in Argentina. He's licensed in Sciences of Education, having graduated in the National University of Catamarca, San Fernando del Valle de Catamarca in Argentina. And he has a master's in education, having specialized in formation of teachers, having graduated from the University of Jaén in Spain. And he is also a doctoral student, a PhD candidate in the Catholic University of Córdoba in Argentina. He also has experience as a teacher in both public and private institutions. And I cannot say how excited I am to listen from a neighbor from Argentina. Professor Bussone, please, So it's a pleasure listening to you.
Muchas gracias, Alexandre. Así que buenas tardes a todos los que están aquí participando de habla española. Good afternoon para los de habla inglesa. Boa tarde para aquellos que hablan língua portuguesa. Es un placer grande poder compartir con ustedes, así que voy a tratar de ser respetuoso del tiempo. Voy a intentar compartir pantalla. Creo que la están viendo, ¿sí? Vamos a ver. A ver, vamos a ver. Bien. ¿Se está pudiendo proyectar?
Sí,
Ok.
sí.
Mi intención es poder establecer un paralelismo y una relación entre los medios de comunicación, sean digitales, sean los medios tradicionales, y también la educación formal o la educación escolar, y establecer vínculo entre tres nociones o conceptos claves, como es verdad, como es conocimiento, y también como lo es la noción de poder, ¿sí? Por eso llamé esta presentación la noción de verdad, de la relación entre poder y conocimiento, ¿sí? Vamos a entender conocimiento en un sentido bastante general, tanto el conocimiento que algunos epistemólogos llaman proposicional, como también el conocimiento de cuestiones directas, ¿sí? A partir del contacto directo con la realidad, ¿sí? Hay una frase de Aristóteles que decía: todo hombre desea naturalmente conocer. Podríamos incluso parafrasearla y decir: todo hombre desea naturalmente conocer la verdad. Desean conocer la verdad. Y lo que dicen y lo que escuchan, lo que ven, desean que sea verdad, que sea verdadero. No se acepta, no se tolera que conocer algo que sea falso. Inclusive cuando esa verdad puede de alguna manera ir en contra de los intereses de esa persona, aún así desea conocer la verdad, aunque más no sea para ocultarla. También de hecho, nadie culpa a nadie por decir la verdad, por lo tanto hay como un imperativo moral en esto de querer conocer la verdad. Nadie culpa a alguien por decir la verdad. Si dice la verdad, en todo caso se le buscará otras excusas para culparlo, pero no por decir la verdad. Hay un imperativo ético en esto. Deseamos conocer la verdad. Y lo que la escuela hace y lo que los medios de comunicación, los medios, sean digitales, sean los medios masivos o tradicionales de comunicación, tratan de transmitir, de comunicar, son conocimientos, ¿sí? A veces incipientes en forma de datos, de información, otras veces forman parte de determinadas teorías, y hay tres condiciones que debe reunir ese conocimiento y que están en esta diapositiva: creencia, verdad y justificación. La creencia es el que, cuando uno maneja alguna información, algún conocimiento, tiene la creencia de que el mismo es cierto, aunque esa no es una condición necesaria, ¿sí? Es condición necesaria, pero no suficiente, perdón. Pero de lo que sí apelamos es que sea verdadero. Pero una cosa es la verdad de ese conocimiento y otra, diferente, es la justificación de esa verdad. Es cuando buscamos pruebas que den cuenta de la verdad de ese conocimiento. Hay ideas, hay informaciones, hay conocimientos o ideas que podemos llegar a tener que desconocemos su verdad, ¿sí? Puede que sean verdaderos o no. Estoy pensando, ¿hay vida fuera del planeta Tierra? Esa afirmación, ¿hay vida fuera del planeta Tierra?, ¿es verdadera o es falsa? Desconocemos. No tenemos pruebas suficientes para justificar la verdad o la falsedad de esa afirmación. Pero indistintamente de esas justificaciones, sigue siendo verdadera o sigue siendo falsa, ¿sí? Pero bueno, igual seguimos apelando, más allá de que tengamos o no justificación, a que ese conocimiento sea verdadero. Pienso en el conocimiento científico. El conocimiento científico se supone que es científico porque hay pruebas suficientes, aunque no concluyentes, porque el conocimiento científico es provisorio, de la verdad del mismo. Ahora, hay distintas posturas sobre la verdad, pero una que es clásica y que de alguna manera sigue vigente, aunque más no sea para contradecirla, es entender la verdad como correspondencia. Es decir, la idea que se sostiene o que se expresa a través de enunciados, a través de imágenes o a través de otros signos o símbolos, ¿sí? Tiene que tener una correspondencia con la realidad a la que se refiere. Por lo tanto, cuando hay una adecuación entre esa realidad y ese conocimiento, esa información, esos datos, decimos que es verdadero. Por lo tanto, la verdad, al menos desde esta perspectiva, es la adecuación, usando términos de Aristóteles, de la inteligencia al objeto al cual se está refiriendo o que está estudiando. Sin embargo, podemos también tener otra visión de verdad, ¿no? Y para esto apelo a estas ideas. Primero, no es lo mismo las ideas que yo puedo tener acerca de la realidad, no es lo mismo la representación que yo pueda tener acerca de la realidad y la realidad a la cual se refiere esa representación. Esta pintura del pintor surrealista belga, ¿sí? No es una pipa, esto no es una pipa, dice allí traducido. Cualquiera que lo ve dice, es una pipa. Sin embargo, no lo es. ¿Por qué? Porque se trata de una representación del objeto pipa. No es la pipa, es una representación, ¿sí? Es como la imagen en el espejo. Es una imagen de mí, pero ese no es Iván. Aunque en el lenguaje ordinario decimos es Iván. Son como las fotos de Facebook, de Instagram, de Twitter, ¿no? Entonces, las imágenes que allí colocamos son una representación de la realidad, pero no es la realidad. Por lo tanto, estamos planteando que hay una diferencia entre la representación y lo representado, entendido que lo representado es la realidad. Ahora bien, para establecer una vinculación con el poder, hay diferentes interpretaciones sobre la realidad. A veces pienso en Nietzsche que decía, hay un hecho, pero hay varias interpretaciones, ¿no? De un hecho puede haber varias interpretaciones. Por eso a veces en distintos medios, sobre un mismo hecho, hay distintas lecturas, distintas representaciones, distintas interpretaciones del mismo hecho. El hecho es el mismo, es idéntico a sí mismo, pero la representación que comunican aún el conocimiento científico y también los medios de comunicación es eso, una representación de esa realidad, ¿sí? Y el tema que eso que se comunica, que se expresa como representación fidedigna de la realidad, se lo plantea y se lo presenta como que es la verdad. Por eso puedo concluir como que eso es verdadero. Por eso puedo concluir que la verdad es hija del poder. ¿Por qué? Porque en definitiva, las representaciones que se van a dar a conocer a través de los medios de comunicación, ¿por qué no también a través del sistema educativo? Es la que determinados grupos de poder político, económico, ideológico, tuvieron para poder imponer como la verdad. Su verdad, esa interpretación o esa representación de la realidad, la impusieron como la verdad. ¿Sí? Entonces, y esto es porque es importante, porque el conocimiento tiene un efecto performativo. En definitiva, eso que yo termino creyendo que es la verdad, que es la realidad, dice, cuando yo creo que esta representación es la realidad, yo termino actuando en función de esa representación. Es el caso, dos ejemplos. El caso de la un ejemplo analógico sería el de la anorexia, ¿no? Esa persona tiene una distorsión de su propio cuerpo, pero actúa en función de esa distorsión, de esa representación distorsionada que tiene acerca de su propio cuerpo. ¿Cuántas veces en campañas electorales se comienza a decir que las estadísticas indican en los medios de comunicación que el ganador es tal candidato? Entonces muchos de los electores terminan diciendo, y lo votemos a él, si al fin y al cabo lo mismo va a ganar. Por lo menos una estrategia que en mi país, Argentina, se utiliza muchísimo. Entonces, esta representación que se toma como verdadera de la realidad, termina generando una determinada conducta que se corresponde con esa representación, lo cual después termina autoconfirmando la supuesta veracidad de la misma. Entonces aquí vemos que hay una clara relación entre verdad, poder y educación. ¿Por qué? Porque en definitiva, aquellos grupos de poder son los que a través de los medios de comunicación masiva o a través de los medios digitales van a imponer esa representación que ellos privilegian de la realidad y que la van a tomar como, y la van a plantear como verdadera. También lo pueden hacer, y por eso es importante en educación, a través del sistema educativo formal. También el sistema educativo puede colaborar con lo que se dice en los medios o puede comunicar esa visión. Por lo tanto, a través de los medios, como también a través del sistema educativo, son dos canales a través de los cuales los grupos de poder pueden imponer su verdad a través de la representación, ¿sí? Quiero mostrarles solamente a modo de ejemplo. En un momento, este mapa mundi del cartógrafo Marcanor mostraba Europa mucho más grande que lo que es efectivamente. El mapa es una representación de la realidad, ¿sí? Pero lo mostraban como la verdad y mostraba mucho más grande a Europa en el centro y mucho más grande. No tengo nada contra los europeos, de hecho yo soy descendiente de europeos, pero, y de hecho este mapa me lo dio en español, pero quiero mostrar cómo esta representación termina distorsionando la realidad. El ejemplo es también el logo de este congreso, donde mostramos el mapa de América al revés, porque siempre nos lo han presentado de otro modo, es una representación. Un ejemplo más que quisiera dar para no extenderme, y a colación de la presentación anterior. Por ejemplo, en la ciudad donde yo vivo, se quería implementar una explotación minera a cielo abierto, siendo que ese es el método más nocivo de explotación minera. Entonces, ¿qué fue lo que hicieron? Usaron el gobierno, los medios masivos de comunicación, para instalar la idea de que era lo mejor para la ciudad. Como eso no dio resultado, había un manual, por ejemplo, de educación ambiental, que en una de sus páginas, elaborado por el Ministerio de Educación de la Nación, decía que el método de explotación minera a cielo abierto era el más nocivo. ¿Qué hicieron? Prohibieron el uso de ese manual y elaboraron un manual diferente, donde la explotación a cielo abierto no se habla. Entonces, ya sea ocultando o ya sea explicitando determinadas representaciones, se termina imponiendo determinada verdad. ¿Cuál? Aquella que determinados grupos hegemónicos o de poder quieren imponer a través del sistema educativo o a través de los medios de comunicación, ¿sí? Con las representaciones que ellos quieren imponer. No quiero extenderme más. Muchas gracias por la atención.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Bussone. It was a privilege listening to you, and I have to confess, I stalked all of you last night in your social media and curricula So I was aware that your presentation, Professor Bussone, would dialogue so heavily, create a heavy dialogue between communication, philosophy, and journalism. It is interesting because all the presentations were exactly what I was expecting, as powerful as I was imagining they would be. So thank you so much. And unfortunately, we have a very short time. I saw that our great assistant, Melina Melgosa, wrote a very interesting question for Professor Perron about how to perform and how to conduct experiences and projects such as those that she has developed. And she gave a marvelous answer in our sidebar, pointing out two strategies that can be used by educators and journalists in seeking to establish and implement projects such as those. So I highly recommend you to read the dialogue that both have developed on the sidebar. I want to invite people to ask other questions too. And while nobody writes, I have a question for both Professor Wittebols and Professor Perron, and a third question for Professor Bussone. For Professor Wittebols and Professor Perron, I would like to ask, which subjects do you think that should be focused on more specifically when approaching media literacy in classes? I think this is perhaps a very important subject. Who would like to start?
You can go ahead, James.
I'm not quite sure what you mean by subjects.
Oh, I was imagining specific issues such as if the approach should be. Oh, I think there was a problem. I think Professor James perhaps fell at his connection. To clarify his question, Professor Perron, I meant if the approach in classroom should. Oh, I think he's back. I think Professor Wittebols is back. Professor Wittebols, can you listen to us? I think.
That was quite a way to avoid answering.
Sensational. While Professor Wittebols is connecting his microphone, Professor Perron, just to clarify, I meant to say in class. Oh, you're back, Professor Wittebols?
Yeah.
Perfect. So just to clarify, my question was, when approaching media literacy in class, do you think it's more important, perhaps, on one hand, analyzing some specific medium, let's say a newspaper or a TV channel, or a specific issue such as climate change, racism, sexism?
Well, I haven't picked a social justice issue, and then they have to look at the range of communication, what's wonderful and what's horrible, what's Nazi-like, whatever. So I want them to encounter shitty news, right? So that they know the difference between the two. So that the subject, like I said, they pick it, they stick with it. That's sort of, and then the way it carries through the three assignments, they come out with a real good understanding. In fact, I think that's what creates the great dialogue in the presentations, is that the other students to say, gee, I went through all this stuff. I have a pretty good command of this stuff. So they ask questions of their peers because they regard them as knowledgeable, which I think is wonderful, because we all know that classroom discussions can fall flat on their face.
And to add to that, I would say, depending, especially I'm working in the high school and sometimes middle school level too, this type of learning or discussion can happen in English class, in government class, in civics class, in math class, in science class, right? When you teach math, you teach statistics, there's data journalism, there's all these different crossover elements that it really falls into in those subjects. And so I think when we're talking about media literacy and news literacy, even more specifically, that can fit into any of these different subjects. In the US, there's at least one state, Illinois, that has a state mandate to teach media literacy throughout the curriculum, which is great and groundbreaking, and not something they do in all the states, but that's really a separate class students will take. And part of that media literacy training is then a focus on news literacy. So, and by that, and preaching to their choir, but more of this idea of being better news consumers, which is so important, as we know, in the college level. It's even more important on the high school level. So the more that we can build in media literacy and news literacy instruction with young people in all the subjects, the more that I think benefits the community and the world overall.
Thank you so much, Professor Perron and Professor Wittebols. It was a marvelous experience listening to you. And I'd like to safeguard the last few minutes just for Professor Bussone, because I have a question for him. Having seen his rich presentation, how can we bring issues such as the nature of truth to classroom? And how can we connect that to media studies, in your opinion, Professor Bussone? And I'm sorry to say this, I would hope to have hours to talk to all of you, but unfortunately we are finishing in just a few minutes. So if you could use these minutes to give your final words to Professor Bussone, I would deeply appreciate it. Thank you.
Bien, no, simplemente algo estaban diciendo recién quienes estamos compartiendo este panel. Planteando diferentes perspectivas es una. Planteando diferentes posturas es una manera de hacerlo. Y después también creo que es muy importante mostrar que la realidad es independiente o es distinta de la representación o de las interpretaciones que se puedan realizar sobre ella. Esto es muy importante. Lo cierto es que las interpretaciones o las representaciones, lo estoy usando como sinónimo, terminan guiando nuestras decisiones y nuestras acciones. Pero es importante diferenciarlas y que muchas veces detrás de esas representaciones hay intereses. Algunos de esos intereses son buenos, son nobles, pero hay otros intereses que tal vez responden a cuestiones más bien mezquinas que no son justas y es importante poderlas visibilizar. Entonces, trabajando casos reales es el mejor modo.
Thank you immensely, Professor Bussone, for your explanation. And I would like to thank all of our brilliant presenters, Professor Wittebols, Professor Perron, Professor Bussone, and to the brilliant staff that has aided us in fulfilling this table, Aaron and Miranda, who were instrumental in providing us this room and fixing all the problems, our brilliant assistant, Melina, and our great interpreters, Ms. Maria Jesus Aracibia and Ms. Annelise Zapata, who did a wonderful job, and also our assistant, Melina Melgosa, who did